shot down 5 times. Douglas Bader, the impossible warrior. Imagine this. You're a fighter pilot, screaming through the sky at 300 miles per hour. Enemy bullets tear through your aircraft. Your plane spirals out of control. You bail out, and as you're falling through the clouds, you look down and realize your legs are gone. Not from this crash. They've been gone for years. You're flying one of the most dangerous missions in human history with 2 tin legs. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Douglas Bader. And if you think losing both legs would end a man's career as a fighter pilot, you don't know Bader. This is the man who was shot down 5 times, walked out of every crash, and became one of the most feared pilots in the Royal Air Force. The Germans had a special name for him. His own commanders couldn't control him. And before this story is over, you'll understand why Winston Churchill himself took notice of this legless legend. If you love stories of impossible courage and defiance against all odds, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel brings you the untold stories of World War II's greatest warriors. But here's what makes Bader's story different from every other war hero you've heard about. Most men lose their legs and learn to walk again. Bader lost his legs and learned to fly again. Most pilots who got shot down once considered themselves lucky to survive. Bader got shot down 5 times and kept coming back for more. Most prisoners of war tried to keep their heads down and survive. Bader became such a problem that the Germans threatened to take away his artificial legs just to stop him from escaping. This is the story of a man who refused to accept what was possible, a man who turned disability into advantage, a man who made the Luftwaffe wish they'd never met him. Let's go back to where it all began. The Golden Boy. December 1928, RAF Cranwell, England. A young cadet with piercing blue eyes and an ego to match his talent strutted across the parade ground. Douglas Robert Stewart Bader was 21 years old, and he was absolutely certain of one thing. He was going to be the greatest pilot the Royal Air Force had ever seen. And you know what? He wasn't exactly wrong. Bader had that rare combination that makes for legendary pilots: natural talent that bordered on instinct, reflexes like a striking cobra, vision that could spot an enemy aircraft while other pilots were still squinting at clouds, and most dangerous of all, he had confidence that crossed the line into arrogance, the kind of swagger that made senior officers want to either promote him or court-martial him, sometimes in the same day. His instructors at Cranwell saw it immediately. This wasn't just another competent pilot going through the motions. This was someone who could feel what an aircraft was doing before the instruments told him. Someone who pushed every plane to its limits and then pushed a little further just to see what would happen. Someone who treated regulations as suggestions and gravity as a personal challenge. At the academy, Douglas Bader played rugby like he flew, with complete disregard for his own safety and absolute commitment to winning. He'd throw his body into scrums with the same enthusiasm he'd throw his aircraft into victory rolls. Broken bones were temporary. Losing was permanent. That was his philosophy. After graduating, Bader was posted to No. 23 Squadron at Kenley, flying Bristol Bulldogs. These were the glory days, the early 1930s, when peacetime RAF flying was less about preparing for war and more about showing off at air displays. For a young pilot with movie star looks and skills to match, it was paradise. Bader became known for his aerobatics, not the standard loops and rolls that looked impressive to civilians. We're talking about the kind of flying that made other pilots shake their heads and walk away. He'd take a bulldog up and dance it through the sky like it weighed nothing. Inverted flying so low that his propeller wash kicked up dust. Slow rolls that should have stalled the engine, but somehow didn't. He was poetry in motion, if poetry involved high explosives and aviation fuel. The air shows loved him. The crowds loved him. His commanding officers tolerated him. Barely. And his fellow pilots? Well, they respected his skill even if they thought he was going to kill himself before he turned 25. They were almost right. December 14th, 1931, the day that everything changed. Reading, England, a small aerodrome that hosted weekend flying clubs and the occasional RAF visit. December 14th, 1931 started as a perfect winter day for flying. Clear skies, light winds, the kind of day that makes you grateful to have wings. Bader was at Reading with 2 other pilots from his squadron. They'd been showing off, doing aerobatics for the members of the local flying club. Standard stuff for Bader, really. A few loops, some rolls, make it look easy and dangerous at the same time. Give the civilians something to talk about at dinner parties. But here's where Bader's confidence became overconfidence. Here's where the golden boy made the kind of mistake that ends careers and lives.
One of the other pilots challenged him. Did he dare to do a slow roll near the ground? Not at a safe altitude where you have room to recover if something goes wrong. Right down on the deck, where one mistake means you're digging your own grave with your propeller. Bader never turned down a challenge. Never. It was the core of who he was. Someone says you can't do something? Watch me do it twice. He took off in his Bristol Bulldog, gained some altitude, then came screaming back toward the aerodrome. Low, way too low. He started the roll. The Bulldog tilted, inverted, and then his wingtip touched the ground. At over 100 miles per hour, the Bulldog cartwheeled across the field like a child's toy thrown by an angry giant. Metal screamed, wood splintered, the engine tore free, the fuselage crumpled like paper. When the wreckage stopped tumbling, Douglas Bader was still inside, barely conscious. Both legs crushed beyond recognition, blood everywhere. The doctors at the Royal Berkshire Hospital didn't think he'd survive the night. His right leg was amputated above the knee that same day. Gangrene set in on the left. 6 days later, they took that one too, also above the knee. 21 years old, both legs gone, flying career over before it really began. That's what everyone thought. Everyone except Bader. The comeback nobody believed was possible. Here's what you need to understand about Douglas Bader. Most people, when they lose both legs, go through stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Bader seems to have skipped straight to, how do I get back in a cockpit? While he was still in the hospital, barely able to sit up without passing out from pain, he was already planning his return to flying. The nurses thought he was delusional. The doctors humored him. His family worried he was in denial. Nobody, and I mean nobody, believed he could do it. They fitted him with artificial legs, 2 heavy, uncomfortable mechanical contraptions that most amputees could barely walk on, let alone live a normal life. These weren't the sophisticated prosthetics we have today. These were essentially wooden pegs and metal joints, crude, heavy, painful. Bader approached learning to walk the same way he approached flying, with absolute, stubborn refusal to accept limitations. If the doctor said it would take 6 months to walk with a cane, he'd do it in 3 months without one. If they said he'd never manage stairs, he'd run up them just to prove them wrong. The pain must have been incredible. Every step on those artificial legs caused pressure sores. The stumps of his thighs would bleed and bruise. The joints would pinch and rub. But Bader had made a decision. Pain was just information, and information could be ignored. Within months, he was walking well enough to fool most people into thinking he had a slight limp. Within a year, he was playing golf, playing tennis, even attempting to dance, though his partners probably had bruised toes to show for it. But walking wasn't enough. Walking wasn't flying. He applied to return to active duty with the RAF.
They said no. He applied again. They said no. He pulled every string, called in every favor, wrote letters to every officer who'd ever liked him. They all said no. The Royal Air Force had a simple policy: no disabled pilots. It didn't matter that Bader could walk. It didn't matter that he could drive a car. It didn't matter that he insisted he could fly better on 10 legs than most pilots could on real ones. Policy was policy. In 1933, the RAF invalidated him out of service. Medically unfit. Pension granted. Career over. Thank you for your service. For most men, this would be the end of the story. The tragic tale of a promising pilot cut down in his prime. But this is Douglas Bader we're talking about. The wilderness years. From 1933 to 1939, Bader lived in what he later called the wilderness years. No flying, no uniform, no purpose. Just a desk job at the Asiatic Petroleum Company, pushing papers and watching the clock. Can you imagine it? Going from dancing through the clouds at 300 miles per hour to sitting in an office, filing reports about petroleum shipments? For a man like Bader, it must have been torture worse than losing his legs. He got married during this time. Thelma Edwards, who'd been his nurse during his recovery, became his wife in 1933. She understood him better than anyone. She knew that underneath the confident swagger was a man fighting demons that had nothing to do with his missing legs.
Depression doesn't announce itself, especially not for men like Bader, who built their entire identity on being tough, being unbreakable, being better than everyone else. But the signs were there: the drinking, the irritability, the sense that life was passing him by while he rotted in an office. He'd hear aircraft overhead and stop whatever he was doing, watching them until they disappeared. He'd visit aerodromes on weekends, standing at the fence like a kid outside a candy store. He'd talk to pilots, mechanics, anyone who'd let him near an aircraft. And everyone knew who he was: the legless pilot, the tragedy, the cautionary tale about why you don't show off at air shows. But here's what kept Bader going through those years. Here's what separated him from every other broken dream in aviation history. He never stopped believing he'd fly again. Not hoping, not wishing, believing, knowing it with the same certainty that he knew his own name. And then, in September 1939, everything changed. The world goes to war. Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. And suddenly, the Royal Air Force needed pilots. Lots of pilots, experienced pilots, pilots who knew how to fly, who knew how to fight, who knew how to lead. Pilots like Douglas Bader. He showed up at the Air Ministry so fast you'd think he'd been camping outside. He demanded to be reinstated. He wasn't asking. He wasn't begging. He was telling them they needed him. And deep down, they knew he was right. But the regulations hadn't changed. The medical standards were clear. No disabled pilots, no exceptions. Bader wouldn't accept it. He called in every favor he'd ever earned. He contacted old squadron mates who were now senior officers. He wrote directly to Air Vice Marshal Halahan, his old commanding officer. He argued, cajoled, threatened, and promised. His argument was simple and devastating. You're about to send 18-year-old boys with minimal training into combat against the Luftwaffe, boys who will be dead within weeks. And you're refusing to use a pilot with hundreds of hours of experience just because he's missing some meat below the knees? Are you trying to win this war or maintain your paperwork? In October 1939, they gave him a medical examination. The doctors expected him to struggle. Instead, Bader passed every test they threw at him. Balance? Perfect. Strength? Above average. Reflexes? Lightning fast. They made him walk up and down stairs. Easy. They made him do physical exercises. No problem. Finally, they put him in a cockpit. And that's when everyone in the room realized they'd been wrong for 6 years. Bader didn't just fly.
He performed aerobatics that made the test pilots dizzy just watching. He put that aircraft through maneuvers that would have challenged any pilot in the RAF. He flew like a man who'd been born with wings, not like someone who'd spent 6 years behind a desk. The examining officer wrote in his report, "This officer is exceptional. Recommend immediate reinstatement to flying duties." In November 1939, Douglas Bader was back on active duty, posted to No. 19 Squadron at Duxford, flying Spitfires. The legless pilot was going to war. Learning to kill. Flying a Spitfire in peacetime is one thing. Flying a Spitfire in combat is something else entirely. And Bader, for all his skill, had never fired his guns at another human being, had never been shot at, had never seen a friend's aircraft explode in midair. He was about to learn. No. 19 Squadron was part of Fighter Command's defense network. In early 1940, they flew patrol after patrol over the English Channel, waiting for the Luftwaffe to come. And come they did. Bader's first combat patrol was in February 1940. No contact with the enemy. Just hours of cold, nerve-wracking flight over gray water, every second wondering if you'd see a Messerschmitt before it saw you. His first confirmed kill came later, during the Battle of France, when he was transferred to No. 222 Squadron, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's premier fighter. Bader got on its tail and held the trigger down until the German aircraft came apart in midair. He described it later with typical Bader understatement. Rather satisfying, actually. But here's what made Bader different from most pilots. Most men, when they shoot down an enemy aircraft, feel something. Horror at taking a life. Guilt. Doubt. Something. Bader felt like he'd won a cricket match. This wasn't cruelty. Bader didn't hate Germans personally. He just compartmentalized everything into winning and losing. And in war, shooting down the enemy was winning. Simple as that. By June 1940, Bader had shot down 3 aircraft. He was given command of No. 242 Squadron, a Canadian squadron that had been decimated during the Battle of France. They were demoralized, under strength, and shell-shocked. He turned them into killers. We're going to stop Part 1 here. In Part 2, we'll see how Bader rebuilt 242 Squadron and led them into the crucible of the Battle of Britain, where his tactics and personality would make him both a legend and a controversy. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss what happens when Bader gets his hands on a squadron of Spitfires and starts hunting the Luftwaffe over England. The transformation from broken pilot to squadron commander is complete. But the real test is coming. The Battle of Britain is about to begin, and Douglas Bader is about to show the world what a man with no legs and no fear can do.
Rebuilding the Broken. June 1940. RAF Colditz Castle. Squadron leader Douglas Bader walked into the dispersal hut of No. 242 Squadron and immediately knew he had a problem. The pilots barely looked up. Some were playing cards with the enthusiasm of men waiting for an execution. Others just stared at nothing. These were the survivors of the Battle of France, the men who'd watched the Luftwaffe tear through the Allied air forces like a chainsaw through paper. They'd seen their friends die. They'd seen squadrons wiped out in single engagements. They'd flown obsolete hurricanes against overwhelming numbers and somehow made it back to England alive. And now they had a new commanding officer. A desk jockey who'd been flying a desk for 6 years. A man with artificial legs who probably couldn't even run to his aircraft if the scramble bell rang. That's what they thought when they first saw Bader. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Bader looked around the room. Then he started shouting. Not encouraging words, not sympathy for what they'd been through. Just pure, undiluted fury. "I don't care what happened in France," he told them. "I don't care how many Messerschmitts you saw. I don't care that you're tired.
You're fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force, and you will act like it. We have hurricanes, we have ammunition, and when the Luftwaffe comes, we are going to kill them. Any questions?" The room was silent. "Good. Anyone who doesn't want to be here can request a transfer right now. Anyone who stays is going to learn to fight my way." Nobody requested a transfer. Bader spent the next weeks transforming 242 Squadron. Not just their tactics, their entire mindset. He flew with them constantly, pushing them harder than they'd ever been pushed. Formation flying until they could hold position in their sleep. Gunnery practice until they could hit a target in a 2-second burst. Tactical discussions where he'd hammer home one lesson. Aggressive offense wins fights. Defensive flying gets you killed. But more than that, he gave them something they'd lost in France: confidence. Because here's the thing about Bader. When you saw him climb into a hurricane with those artificial legs, when you watched him fly aerobatics that most able-bodied pilots wouldn't attempt, when you realized he'd fought harder than any of them just to get back in a cockpit, it made your own problems seem smaller. If Bader could fly and fight with no legs, what excuse did anyone else have? If you're enjoying this story of leadership under fire, take a second to hit that like button. It helps other people discover these incredible true stories. By August 1940, number 242 Squadron was ready. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to be tested in the biggest air battle in history. The Battle of Britain was coming. The Battle of Britain, Bader's War, begins. History books will tell you the Battle of Britain officially started on July 10, 1940, but for 242 Squadron, it really began on August 30, 1940. That morning, Bader led his squadron on patrol over the Thames estuary. Routine stuff, or so they thought. Then someone spotted them. Bombers. Dozens of them. Heinkel 111s and Dornier 17s flying in tight formation toward London. And around them, like a swarm of angry hornets, at least 50 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Bader had 12 Hurricanes. Most commanders would have radioed for reinforcements. Most commanders would have positioned for a careful, coordinated attack. Most commanders would have been thinking about how to survive this. Bader saw a target-rich environment. "Tally-ho!" he called over the radio, and dove straight into the formation. You need to understand what this meant. The Luftwaffe formation was 3 miles wide and thousands of feet deep. It was a flying fortress of metal and firepower. Diving into it was like jumping into a meat grinder with a knife. But Bader had realized something that many other commanders hadn't. The bomber crews were terrified of head-on attacks. They had guns pointing every direction except straight ahead where the pilot sat. And if you came at them from that direction, fast and aggressive, they broke formation. So that's exactly what he did. Bader picked a Dornier, aimed directly at its nose, and held his course. The Hurricane's 8 machine guns hammered out bullets at a combined rate of 9,600 rounds per minute. The Dornier's windshield shattered, the pilot died at the controls, the bomber rolled over and fell out of the sky. Behind Bader, 242 Squadron followed their commander into hell. And the Luftwaffe formation, which had been flying in disciplined order towards its target, suddenly scattered like pigeons facing a hawk. In the chaos that followed, 242 Squadron shot down 12 German aircraft without losing a single Hurricane. Bader had proven his point. Aggression worked. The Big Wing controversy. This is where Bader's story gets complicated, where his greatest strength became his greatest weakness, where his results were undeniable but his methods were questioned. After that August 30th success, Bader became convinced he'd discovered the key to winning the Battle of Britain. Don't send up squadrons individually. Don't fight the Luftwaffe with 12 fighters at a time. Mass your forces. Get 3, 4, 5 squadrons together in a massive formation, a big wing, and hit the Germans with overwhelming force. He took this idea to Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of No. 12 Group. Leigh-Mallory loved it. Here was a combat-proven squadron commander saying exactly what Leigh-Mallory wanted to hear. But Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, which defended London and the southeast, hated it. Park's problem was simple: time. When the radar stations detected incoming German raids, his squadrons had maybe 15 minutes to get airborne, gain altitude, and intercept. 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if they were lucky. Assembling a big wing of 5 squadrons, getting them all in formation and positioning them to attack could take 30 minutes or more. By that time, the German bombers had already hit their target and were heading home. Bader argued that if you hit them with 50 fighters instead of 12, it didn't matter if you were a few minutes late. You'd devastate them. Park countered that a few minutes late meant British cities got bombed. The argument went all the way up to Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command. It became personal, it became political, it threatened to tear Fighter Command apart at the exact moment when unity was most critical. And here's the thing: they were both right. Bader's big wing, when it worked, was devastating. On September 9, 1940, Bader led a formation of 60 fighters against a German raid. They shot down 20 enemy aircraft in a single engagement. It was the kind of victory that made headlines. But Park's squadrons were stopping German raids before they reached their targets. They were saving lives and infrastructure. They were winning the war of attrition. The debate has continued among historians for 80 years, but here's what's not debatable. Douglas Bader, flying with 2 artificial legs, was leading the largest fighter formations in the Battle of Britain and making the Luftwaffe pay in blood for every mile of British airspace. The daily grind of air combat. Let's talk about what it was actually like to fly combat missions with Douglas Bader. Because the tactics and politics are one thing, the reality of war is something else. A typical day started before dawn. Bader would wake up, strap on his artificial legs, which took 15 minutes and hurt like hell, get dressed, and head to dispersal. By the time the sun came up, he was sitting in his Hurricane, ready to go. The waiting was the worst part. You sat there in full flight gear, parachute already on, just waiting for the telephone to ring. Sometimes it rang within minutes. Sometimes you waited all day. The tension was constant. When the call came, you had 2 minutes to get airborne. 2 minutes. For most pilots, this meant sprinting to their aircraft. For Bader, sprinting wasn't an option. So he walked fast, his artificial legs making a distinctive clacking sound on the tarmac. His ground crew would already have his Hurricane running, waiting for him to climb in. And here's something most people don't think about. Getting into a fighter aircraft with artificial legs is not easy. The cockpit was tight. You had to climb up on the wing, swing yourself over, drop in, and squeeze into a space that was basically molded around a human body. A body with knees that bent. Bader's legs didn't bend quite right. Every time he got in and out of his Hurricane, it was a minor wrestling match. His ground crew learned to help without making it obvious. Bader hated being helped. Once airborne, the artificial legs became an advantage. Sounds crazy, but it's true. In a high-speed turn, human pilots would black out from G-forces. Blood drains from your head to your legs. Your vision goes gray, then black. You lose consciousness. Bader's legs were 10. No blood to drain. He could pull turns that would have knocked out other pilots and stay conscious the whole time. The Germans noticed. They couldn't understand how this British pilot could outturn them at speeds that should have made him pass out. Combat itself happened at speeds your brain couldn't fully process. You'd spot an enemy aircraft, you'd maneuver to get on their tail, you'd fire a burst, maybe 2 seconds long, then you'd be past them, looking for the next target, or checking your 6 o'clock for the Messerschmitt trying to kill you.
Bader's gunnery was exceptional. He'd trained himself to shoot in short, precise bursts. Ammunition was limited. Every bullet had to count. He'd get close, sometimes impossibly close, before firing. 100 yards, 50 yards, close enough to see the rivets on the enemy aircraft. His kill tally climbed. 5 aircraft, 10, 15. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he was an ace several times over. More importantly, 242 Squadron had become one of the most effective units in fighter command. But with success came danger. The more you flew, the more you pushed your luck. And luck, as any combat pilot will tell you, eventually runs out. Shot down, the first time. September 7, 1940, 242 Squadron scrambled to intercept a massive Luftwaffe raid on London. Over 200 German aircraft were heading for the city. Bader led his squadron straight into them. The fight was chaos. Aircraft everywhere, twisting and turning, guns hammering. Smoke trails marking where planes had been hit. Parachutes blossoming where pilots had bailed out. And somewhere in that maelstrom, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 got on Bader's tail. The first indication was bullet holes appearing in his Hurricane's wing. Then his canopy shattered. Then something hit his engine, and oil sprayed back across his windscreen, blinding him. Bader did what he'd trained to do. He pushed the stick forward and dove. A Bf 109 pilot couldn't follow a dive without blacking out, but Bader could. He went nearly vertical, screaming toward the earth at speeds that made his Hurricane shake like it was coming apart. The Messerschmitt couldn't follow, but Bader's Hurricane was dying. Engine temperature climbing, oil pressure dropping. He was going to have to put it down. He found a field, brought the Hurricane in with no engine power, and executed a perfect forced landing. The aircraft slid across the grass, spun around, and stopped. Bader unstrapped, climbed out, and walked away. His artificial legs had saved him again. If he'd had real legs, the impact forces would have shattered his ankles. Instead, his prosthetics had absorbed the shock. A farmer found him and asked if he was all right. "Perfectly fine," Bader said. "Any chance of a lift back to my aerodrome?" 2 days later, he was flying again. Promotion and responsibility. By December 1940, Douglas Bader's reputation was established. He was more than a successful pilot. He was a leader, a tactician, and a propaganda asset. The legless pilot who'd shot down 20 German aircraft was headline material. He was promoted to wing commander and given command of the Tangmere Wing, 3 squadrons of Spitfires. This was the big time. 60 fighters under his command, the freedom to develop tactics, the responsibility for hundreds of men's lives. Bader attacked the role with characteristic aggression. He demanded the best from his pilots and gave them the best training. He flew more combat missions than any other wing commander in fighter command. He pushed his maintenance crews to keep the aircraft ready. He argued with higher headquarters when he thought they were wrong, which was often. And he kept shooting down German aircraft. By early 1941, the Battle of Britain was won. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The invasion of Britain was cancelled. Churchill's words about "never in the field of human conflict" had been proven true. The few had defeated the many. But the war wasn't over. If anything, it was intensifying. Fighter Command went on the offensive. Instead of waiting for the Germans to come to Britain, they'd go to the Germans. Offensive sweeps over occupied France. Free hunts where squadrons would cross the Channel looking for trouble. Circus operations where bombers would deliberately act as bait to draw up German fighters. Bader loved it. Finally, he could take the fight to the enemy. Into occupied France. Spring and summer of 1941.
Bader led the Tangmere wing on sweep after sweep across the channel. They'd fly at high altitude, 20 or 30,000 feet, looking for German fighters. When they found them, Bader would lead the attack. His tactics evolved. He'd learned from the Battle of Britain that altitude was life. The squadron with the height advantage could choose whether to fight or run. So his wing would always try to get above the Germans before attacking.
His radio discipline was terrible. Officially, you were supposed to use proper call signs and procedures. Bader would get on the radio and say things like, "Bandits at 3 o'clock, let's get the bastards," in a voice that could be heard in Berlin. The Germans definitely heard him. They started to recognize his voice. They knew when Bader was in the air, and they responded accordingly. Sometimes they'd avoid his sector entirely. Sometimes they'd mass extra fighters specifically to go after him. Bader's score kept climbing. 25 kills, 28, 30. He was becoming one of the highest-scoring Allied pilots of the war. But the deeper they flew into France, the more dangerous it became. If you got shot down over Britain, you could bail out and be back at your aerodrome the same day. If you got shot down over France, you were either dead or prisoner of war. Bader knew the risks. He just didn't care. On June 21st, 1941, Bader led a sweep over France. They encountered Messerschmitt Bf-109s. A massive dogfight erupted. Bader shot down 2 aircraft in quick succession, bringing his total to 30 confirmed kills. He was untouchable, invincible, the legless ace who defied every expectation and beaten every odd. But pride comes before a fall, and Bader's fall was coming. August 9th, 1941, the day the legend ended. It was a circus operation, bombers attacking a power station near Lille, escorted by 12 squadrons of fighters. Bader led the Tangmere wing as top cover. The German fighters came up in force, at least 50 Bf-109s waiting at altitude. They'd been expecting this raid. They were ready. The dogfight that followed was brutal. Aircraft spinning and climbing and diving in 3 dimensions, tracers lighting up the sky, explosions marking where planes had been hit, radio calls overlapping as pilots called out targets and threats. Bader shot down a Bf-109, then another. He was completely focused on the enemy in front of him, which meant he wasn't watching his 6 o'clock. Nobody knows exactly what happened next. Bader always claimed he was in a mid-air collision with a German fighter. German records suggest he was shot down. Either way, the result was the same. His Spitfire came apart in midair. The tail section separated from the fuselage. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin. Bader tried to bail out, but his artificial right leg was trapped in the wreckage. He was pinned in a spinning aircraft, heading for the ground, with one leg caught. At this point, most men would have panicked. Most men would have died. Bader released the straps holding his artificial leg on and pulled himself free. He left his right leg behind, still trapped in the cockpit, and fell clear of the aircraft. His parachute opened. He was alive. But he was falling toward occupied France with one artificial leg and no idea what waited below. This is where Part 2 ends. In Part 3, we'll see what happened when the Luftwaffe captured Britain's most famous fighter pilot. We'll see Bader's incredible escape attempts, his battles with German officers, and the legacy he left behind. The war isn't over for Douglas Bader. In some ways, it's just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed because Part 3 is going to show you a different kind of courage. The courage to never surrender, even when you're behind enemy lines with one leg. The legend has fallen, but legends don't stay down for long.
Falling into enemy hands. August 9th, 1941. Douglas Bader was falling through the sky over occupied France with one artificial leg, a parachute that might not have been packed properly, and absolutely no plan for what came next. The parachute opened. That was the good news. The bad news? He could see German soldiers running toward his landing spot. He was coming down in a field surrounded by Wehrmacht troops, miles behind enemy lines, with no weapon and no way to run. Bader hit the ground hard. With only one artificial leg, he couldn't land in the standard parachute roll. He crumpled, fell, and lay there trying to catch his breath while German soldiers surrounded him with rifles pointed at his head. One of the soldiers, an officer, stepped forward and stared at Bader. Then he noticed the artificial leg, or rather, he noticed there was only one leg, and it was made of metal. "England or pilot?" the officer asked in broken English. "Wing Commander Douglas Bader, Royal Air Force," Bader replied, giving his rank, name, and serial number. That's all prisoners of war were required to say under the Geneva Convention. The German officer looked genuinely shocked. "You are the pilot with no legs?" "That's right," Bader said, "and I'd very much like my other leg back. I left it in my aircraft." You have to understand the audacity of this moment. Bader had just been shot down, captured, and was surrounded by enemy soldiers, and his first concern was retrieving his spare prosthetic leg from his crashed Spitfire. The Germans, to their credit, actually tried to find it. They searched the wreckage, but the leg had been destroyed in the crash. Bader was now a prisoner of war with only one artificial leg, which made walking extremely difficult and escaping nearly impossible. Nearly impossible. Not completely impossible. The Luftwaffe's respect. Bader was taken to a Luftwaffe base near Saint-Omer for interrogation. This is where something unexpected happened, something that reveals a complicated truth about war. The German pilots knew who he was. They'd heard his voice on the radio. They'd fought against him. Some of them had seen friends shot down by the legless British ace. And instead of treating him as an enemy to be humiliated, they treated him as a fellow warrior to be respected. Adolphe Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces and a general at the age of 29, came to meet Bader personally. They talked shop, fighter tactics, aircraft performance, the kind of conversation that pilots have when they're not actively trying to kill each other. Galland arranged for Bader to get a new artificial leg. Not from German supplies, which would have been reasonable. No, Galland contacted the RAF through the Red Cross and asked the British to drop a new prosthetic leg by parachute. The British agreed, on the condition that Bader's wife could include a personal package with it. So here's the surreal part. In the middle of a war where both sides were bombing each other's cities and killing each other by the thousands, the Luftwaffe and the RAF cooperated to get Douglas Bader a new leg. The RAF dropped the leg during a bombing raid. Along with it came a letter from Bader's wife, a package of personal items, and probably a few tons of high explosives on nearby German positions. War is weird. When Bader got his new leg, the first thing he did was try to escape. The escape artist. You need to understand something about prisoner of war camps in World War II. The Geneva Convention said you had to treat prisoners humanely, feed them, house them, give them medical care. But it also said that prisoners had a duty to try to escape, and guards had a duty to stop them. It was, in a strange way, a game. A deadly game, but one with rules. Bader was sent to a POW camp at Lübeck. Within 48 hours, he'd been caught trying to climb out a window. They sent him to another camp. He tried to escape again, this time by hiding in a garbage cart. They sent him to another camp. He tied bedsheets together and tried to climb down from a third-floor window. The Germans were getting frustrated. Bader was supposed to be disabled. He was supposed to be easy to guard. Instead, he was becoming the biggest escape risk in the entire camp. Finally, they threatened to take away his artificial legs. If he tried to escape one more time, they'd confiscate his prosthetics. He'd have to crawl everywhere. They weren't joking. Bader backed off. Temporarily. If you're inspired by stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Colditz, where troublemakers go. After multiple escape attempts, the Germans decided Bader needed special accommodation. They sent him to Colditz Castle, the prisoner of war camp reserved for the most persistent escape artists and troublesome officers in the entire German POW system. Colditz was built on a cliff, surrounded by walls, guarded by soldiers who'd been specifically trained to prevent escapes. If you ended up in Colditz, it meant you'd been such a problem elsewhere that the Germans wanted you somewhere they could watch you constantly. Bader was in good company. The camp was full of British, French, Polish, and Dutch officers who'd all earned their place through sheer determination to escape. These weren't just soldiers, these were men who'd turned escape planning into a science. Within weeks of arriving, Bader was part of an escape committee. They were planning a mass breakout through a tunnel. Bader couldn't dig, not with his artificial legs, but he could help plan, create diversions, and generally make the guards' lives difficult. The guards at Colditz had a grudging respect for Bader. He was polite, mostly. He followed the rules, mostly. But he never stopped looking for weaknesses in the security, never stopped measuring distances, never stopped calculating angles and timing. The Germans tried to make his life easier, which ironically made it harder for him to escape. They gave him a ground floor room, so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. But a ground floor room meant he was easier to watch. They gave him extra rations to compensate for the energy his prosthetics required, but extra rations meant he was healthier and more capable of trying something dangerous. It was a strange relationship. The guards respected him. The camp commandant even invited him to dinner occasionally, but they never trusted him, not for a second. The propaganda war. While Bader was in Colditz, the war continued, and both sides discovered that Douglas Bader was worth more as a symbol than as a prisoner. The British used him for propaganda. Wing Commander Bader, who lost both legs and became one of our greatest aces, is now a prisoner, but the spirit that drove him to fly will drive us to victory. That sort of thing. The Germans tried to use him too, but Bader refused to cooperate. They offered him better conditions if he'd make a radio broadcast or appear in a photograph. He told them to go to hell, albeit more politely. But here's what's interesting. Bader's presence in Colditz inspired other prisoners. If a man with no legs could try to escape 5 times, what excuse did anyone else have? His determination became contagious. The other prisoners organized entertainment to keep morale up, theatrical productions, debate societies, educational lectures. Bader participated in all of it, but his heart was always focused on one thing: getting out. The tunnel project at Colditz continued for months. Dozens of men working in shifts, digging through rock and dirt with improvised tools. They were getting close, really close. Freedom was maybe weeks away. And then in April 1945, they heard something that changed everything. The war ends. Artillery fire. American artillery, getting closer every day. The guards at Colditz knew what was coming. Everyone knew what was coming. Germany was losing. The Third Reich was collapsing. The question wasn't who would reach Colditz first and what would happen to the prisoners before they arrived. Some of the more fanatical guards wanted to kill the prisoners rather than let them be liberated. Some wanted to use them as hostages. The camp commandant, to his credit, refused both options. He ordered his men to stand down and wait for the Americans to arrive. On April 16, 1945, American forces liberated Colditz Castle. Douglas Bader walked out of captivity after 3 years and 8 months as a prisoner of war. He'd been shot down 5 times in his career. He'd escaped or attempted to escape from German custody more than any other British officer. He had refused to be broken, refused to be silent, refused to accept his circumstances. When the American soldiers asked who he was, he straightened up, looked them in the eye, and said exactly what he'd said to the German officer who captured him nearly 4 years earlier, Wing Commander Douglas Bader, Royal Air Force.
Coming home. The journey home was slower than Bader would have liked. Debriefing, medical examinations, paperwork, the bureaucracy of war. But by June 1945, he was back in Britain, reunited with his wife Thelma, and facing a question he hadn't considered in years. What do you do after you've done the impossible? The war was over. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan would surrender in August. The world was at peace, or at least at peace compared to what it had been. Bader was 35 years old, still relatively young, but he'd been flying combat missions and surviving prison camps for 6 years. His body was exhausted. His artificial legs needed replacement, and the RAF was downsizing rapidly as millions of servicemen returned to civilian life. They offered him a peacetime commission, a desk job, a comfortable position where he could train new pilots, maybe work on tactics development. The kind of role that would let him finish his career with dignity and a good pension. Bader turned it down. He'd already done the desk job once, remember? In the 1930s, when the RAF first invalided him out? He'd hated every minute of it. He wasn't going to spend another 20 years pushing papers and watching other people fly. Instead, he went back to civilian life. He rejoined the Shell Oil Company, which had employed him before the war. He became a public speaker, telling his story at schools, military functions, and corporate events. He became an advocate for disabled people, proving through his own example that disability didn't mean inability. But he never stopped flying. He got his civilian pilot's license and flew for pleasure whenever he could. Right up until his 70s, Douglas Bader was taking aircraft up and reminding himself what freedom felt like. The legacy of a legend. Let's talk about what Douglas Bader proved. He proved that physical disability doesn't define capability. In an era when losing your legs meant your life was essentially over, Bader became one of the most successful fighter pilots of World War II. He proved that leadership isn't about perfection. Bader was arrogant, stubborn, and often difficult to work with, but his pilots would have followed him anywhere because they knew he'd never ask them to do something he wouldn't do first. He proved that aggression, when properly channeled, wins wars. His tactics were controversial, but they worked. The big wing may have had its problems, but when Bader led 50 fighters into combat, the Germans paid attention.
He proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. Every time Bader climbed into a cockpit with those artificial legs, he was making a choice. And he made that choice hundreds of times. But maybe most importantly, he proved that your past doesn't determine your future. He could have ended his story in that hospital bed in 1931, a 21-year-old pilot with no legs and no prospects. Instead, he wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in military aviation history. The Germans respected him. The British celebrated him. His own pilots would have died for him. And 80 years later, we're still telling his story. The final years. Bader lived until 1982, 51 years after the crash that took his legs, long enough to see the world he'd fought for, to see Britain rebuild, to see aviation technology advance beyond anything he'd imagined in his Spitfire. He was knighted in 1976, becoming Sir Douglas Bader. Not for his wartime service, which somehow never earned him a knighthood, but for his work helping disabled people after the war. The government finally recognized that his real achievement wasn't shooting down aircraft. It was proving that disability could be overcome. He stayed friends with several German pilots he'd fought against, including Adolf Galland. After the war, they'd meet at air shows and reunions, two old warriors remembering battles that seemed like they'd happened in another lifetime. When Bader died in 1982, he was given a full military funeral. Thousands attended, former pilots, some who'd flown with him, some who'd fought against him, disabled veterans who'd been inspired by his example, people who'd never met him but knew his story. What can we learn from Douglas Bader in 2025? First, obstacles are what you make of them. Losing both legs at 21 would destroy most people. Bader turned it into his origin story. Second, leadership means going first.
Bader never asked his pilots to do anything he wouldn't do. He led from the front, literally and figuratively. Third, never stop fighting. Whether it was fighting the Germans, fighting the bureaucracy that wanted to ground him, or fighting the guards at Colditz, Bader never accepted defeat. Fourth, respect your enemies. Bader and the German pilots understood each other in ways that civilians never could. They were trying to kill each other professionally, but they respected the skill and courage that required. Fifth, your circumstances don't define your potential. Bader was told he'd never fly again. He was told he'd never walk properly. He was told to accept his limitations. He ignored all of it and became a legend. The final word. Douglas Bader shot down at least 30 enemy aircraft. He survived being shot down 5 times. He attempted multiple escapes from German prison camps. He lived another 37 years after the war, proving that determination beats disability every single time. But his story is more than just numbers and achievements. It's about the human spirit, about refusing to quit when everyone tells you it's impossible, about leading from the front, about turning your greatest weakness into your greatest strength. When Bader lost his legs, doctors said he'd never walk normally. He proved them wrong. When the RAF said he'd never fly again, he proved them wrong. When the Germans captured him, he refused to stay captured. When life threw impossible obstacles at him, he climbed over them. That's the lesson. That's what makes his story worth telling 80 years later. We live in a world that loves to tell us what we can't do, what's impossible, what we should accept. Douglas Bader's life is a middle finger to all of that. He didn't accept, he didn't quit, he didn't let anyone tell him what he couldn't do. And neither should you. If this story inspired you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think, and subscribe to this channel because we've got more incredible World War II stories coming your way. Bader's story is one of thousands from World War II. Men and women who did impossible things, who faced unimaginable odds, who changed history. Next week, we're covering another hero you've probably never heard of, another story of courage under fire, another chapter in humanity's greatest conflict. The greatest generation earned that title for a reason. They faced the worst humanity had to offer and somehow found the best within themselves. Their stories deserve to be told. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered. That's what we do here. We bring you the stories that history forgot, the heroes who deserved medals but got nothing except the knowledge that they did their duty. The battles that changed everything but never made the headlines. Bader proved that impossible is just a word. The next hero we cover will prove it again. Make sure you're subscribed. Turn on notifications because these aren't just stories. They're lessons. They're inspiration. They're proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when everything depends on it. See you in the next one. And remember, if a man with no legs can become one of the greatest fighter pilots in history, what's your excuse? Fly high, fight hard, never surrender.